based on the evidence presented at the hearing. To mourn victims of the massacre and bring to the forefront war crimes of the Japanese army, China set December 13th as a National Memorial Day. More than remembering Nanjing, the date is also a reminder of the calamities of war and Chinese people's tenacity for peace and safeguarding human dignity.
And those victims of the Nanjing Massacre are mourned by the Chinese as well as people from all over the world. According to the verdict by the Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal on March the 10th, 1947, more than 190,000 Chinese civilians and soldiers were slaughtered during the massacre. The court also stated that more than 150,000 victims of barbarous acts were buried by charity organizations. The accurate number of total fatalities is estimated to be more than 300,000. People killed in the 6-week massacre made up 1.5% of the total death during the 14-year war of resistance against the Japanese aggression, in which 20 million were killed and 15 million wounded. The war of resistance against Japanese aggression helped contain the Japanese army from expanding in Asia. China fought some of the most difficult battles on the Eastern Front of the Second World War and prevented the Axis nations from taking over more Asian lands. And more on the memorial services. Let's try crossover to our reporter Su Yuting, who is right now in front of the Memorial Hall in Nanjing. So Yuting, good morning. Give us an idea. What is it like in the Memorial Hall and what is the agenda?
Yes, as you can see behind me, there are thousands of people have been already here for the Memorial Day for the victims of the Nanjing Massacre by Japanese invaders. And I'm now standing at the site which stands on the massacre of the Qingdao Gate and Jiangmen Gate. And you know that this day is very significant because it's the 4th Memorial Day and it's also the 80th anniversary of the Nanjing Massacre. And as you can see behind me, this is the wall named the Wall of Calamity. And you know that the figures 300,000 was also carved on the wall in 12 different languages to commemorate the victims and to remember the history. And you know that today's event is also very significant because I previously talked to some of the attendees. They told me that the significance of the event is not only to remember the history. We should remember what happened here, but we should not remember with hatred. And as you can see that these Assembly Square, if we just look high upon the sky to this Assembly Square, is the shape of the ship. So we also call this Memorial Hall of the Victims as the ship for peace. That means we will just sail this ship towards peace and prosperity. And you know that everyone is also very looking forward to today's National Memorial Day. And for more on that, I'm very glad to join by one of the descendants of the foreign friends, because you know that previously during the Nanjing Massacre, many of the international friends risked life in recording the atrocities committed by the Japanese soldiers. And one of them is American priest John McGee. John McGee has used his camera to record the atrocities committed by the Japanese soldiers and invaders. And today we will have the grandson of John McGee, and his name is Chris McGee. Chris, good to have you on CGTN. We know that today you will also attend the National Memorial Day. So could you please tell us what's your expectation of the event?
My expectation is to join with the people of Nanjing and the people of China to mourn the dead and to celebrate the living who survived the Nanjing Massacre. I think it's a really important time for all of us to come together and remember this and not let this be forgotten in history.
And we know that over there it's the exhibition hall of the Memorial Hall, and inside that newly redirected the hall, we can see the camera used by your grandfather, John McGee.
Yes.
Could you please tell us what kind of stories that your grandfather have told you? Is there any impressed you most?
Well, I think I heard stories about my grandfather from when I was very small. To me, the most impressive story is the fact that he sometimes was asked to, during the Nanjing Massacre, he was asked to go out and stop Japanese soldiers who were in the homes of Chinese friends and neighbors. And sometimes he succeeded. He told the Japanese soldiers to get out, and they would not murder and rape as they had intended to. So to me, that's the most impressive thing that he did, I think, for me, besides also filming the atrocities for humanity to see and remember.
Yeah, we will all remember and to praise the contributions made by your grandfather and also some of the other international friends. And could you please tell us what do you think is the significance of holding such kind of National Memorial Day to remember the victims?
I think it's very important to remember the great tragedies and massacres of history. Otherwise, we will always repeat them. I think people become too objective about history and they forget what destruction can be caused by, in such a short period of time, by an invading army. We come here to remember humanity and to remember not to let this happen again.
Yes, indeed. We should remember the history, but not the hatred itself, right?
Yes, I agree with you.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris McGee. Thank you.
Nice
Thank
to
you
see
very
you
much
again.
for your time.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Well, just as Chris McGee said, that we should just use this kind of commemoration to remember the history, because that's one of the darkest history on human history. And we should remember the history and also to promote people's yearning for peace and also a better future. Back to you.
As we can see, there are young students, also servicemen behind you. What kind of a turnout is at the memorial service, and what are the programs for this morning?
Yes, Doyue, you know that previously at 7 a.m. this morning, a flag-raising ceremony was held. And as you can see that the flag is now at half-mast. And the people behind me are thousands of people, including the school children and also survivors of the massacre, and also the families of the victims, veterans, soldiers, and also foreign friends. And you know that one of the significance for today's event is Xi Jinping, the president, and also General Secretary of the CPC Central Committee, and also chairman of the Central Military Commission will also attend this ceremony. And this is the second time for Xi to attend this National Memorial Day. He has delivered a keynote speech in 2014. That's the first National Memorial Day in 2014. And you know that Yu Zhengsheng, the chairman of the National Committee for the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, will also stand high upon that stage and deliver the keynote speech for today's National Memorial Day ceremony. And you know that at 10 a.m., that's less than half an hour, the event will soon begin, and people will sing the national anthem, and also they will pay a silent tribute for 1 minute, and the siren symbolizing for grief will blare across the city. And after that, you know that the Guard of Honor will lay wreaths in front of the memorial for the victims. And later, the young people will stand in here, and the Declaration of Peace will be read out, and then the bell of peace will be sounded, and also dozens, maybe thousands of the doves will be released as well. So this ceremony is not only to remember the history, but also to promote people's awareness for peace and to build a community with a shared future for mankind. Back to you.
All right. Thank you, Yuting, for your reporting from the Memorial Hall in Nanjing. And actually, memorial activities will also be held at different mass graves of the massacre victims in Nanjing. Was over 300,000 Chinese killed during the atrocities in 1937. It is simply no surprise there are many mass gravesites scattered all over Nanjing. And now we have two reporters standing by at two memorial the grave sites. One is Zheng Yibin at the Zhongshan Wharf mass grave, and Yang Chenxi at Qingdao Mountain mass graves. Good morning to both of you. Let me start with you, Yibin. The Zhongshan Wharf mass grave, it is by the side of the Yangtze River. Set the scene for us. What happened 80 years ago?
Well, yes, so yeah. Well, this is a Zhongshan dock at the south bank of the Yangtze River, in northern part of the Nanjing, in eastern part of the South China's Jiangsu province. And this place, we can see there's a monument reminding people not to forget their history. And this morning, hundreds of people gathering here, including government officials and middle school students from the neighboring communities, and Chinese soldiers from the National Defense Universities and workers from the neighboring areas. They gathering here and pay tribute to the victims who perished during the massacre 80 years ago. And Zhongshan Dock was really special. It's back to 80 years ago. This place was once the transportation hub for Nanjing, the then capital of China. And this place, all of the ships and trains have to cross this dock into and out of Nanjing. So it was, and it became the target of Japanese invaders back then. And after the Battle of Nanjing broke out at the very early December 1937, this place, and also there is a very important thing that the power plant is also located here. The Chinese soldiers were trying to evacuate from this area. So back then, this place was really an important and a key hub for transportation and for the Chinese soldier and civilians. This morning, a lot of people gathering here to pay tribute, and we can come any closer to the riverside of the Yangtze River. According to the historical facts, over 10,000 people were killed at this site during the Nanjing Massacre. On December 16, 1937, in the evening, Japanese soldiers rounded up more than 5,000 Chinese. They believed that Chinese soldiers from the international safety zone. They had taken these people here and bounded them with ropes and killed them in groups with machine guns. And 2 days later, another catastrophe happened to 4,000 people in the same place. And also 8 refugees, including women and children, were killed in the same way. According to the description of the survivors of the Nanjing Massacre, well, back then, along the Yangtze River, hundreds of the thousands of dead bodies were flowing along the river, and the water was red with blood. So this morning, a memorial service will be held here very soon. It is not to prolong the hatred, but to value the peace and let people remember history and not to let it happen again. So yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Yibin, for your reporting from Zhongshan Wharf mass grave site. Let's turn to another grave site. That's our reporter Yang Chenxi is right now at Qingdao Mountain mass grave. Good morning, Chenxi. As we just heard, at the Zhongshan Wharf grave, most of the casualties were Chinese servicemen. But what is exactly happened in Qingdao Mountain site?
Good morning, Zhou Yue. We are now at the Qingdao Mountain mass grave in the outskirts of Nanjing. This is one of the many burial sites for the 300,000 Chinese people killed in the Nanjing Massacre, which started on this very day 80 years ago and went on for weeks. We have 16 other sites like this around Nanjing City, and it just goes to show the extent of the historic atrocity. Now, this site is located inside the Hohai University. Back then, this place was still a piece of uninhabited wild land, but it was used by the Japanese army to bury the over 1,000 citizens from the nearby Wujiaxiang and Hanjiaqiao area who were brutally murdered, being innocent civilians. Every year, teachers and students here at the Hohai University, as well as citizens who live nearby, come on December the 13th to hold a memorial event that is about to happen right behind us. For more, we are joined by one faculty member of the Hohai University, Ms. Li Wanting, to tell us more about the arrangement today. So can you tell us more about what we are expecting today?
We can see nearly 500 people stand in front of the monument, including students, teachers from Pekai University, as well as people living nearby. Before 10 o'clock, they came here to begin a series of commemoration activities, including laying flowers and reading, reciting poetry to remember the victims in the crime.
So you are a local Nanjing citizen, yes?
Yes.
So can you tell us about the special place that this part of history has in the hearts of the local people here?
When I was a child, my grandmother told me a lot about the histories from time to time. So each day this year, we are impressed and think of the crime against humanity, and I think the national, this national memorial service shows the world that we always remember the history, and we have strong determination to safeguard peace. A sentence always bears in my mind: experiences of past, if not forgotten, are a guide for the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing. The students will recite poems and observe a moment of silence in front of a monument right behind us. Now, carved on the monument behind us are 4 Chinese characters that says, "We live in peaceful times, but we should always be prepared for danger." Back to you, Zhou Yuan.
All right. Thank you so much, Cheng Xi, for your reporting from Qingdao mass gravesite. And to talk about this dark chapter of the Chinese history, we're joined in the studio by Mr. Yang Xiyu, Senior Fellow from China Institute of International Studies. Good morning, Mr. Yang.
Good morning.
Let's go back to 80 years ago. We know that the July incident of Marco Polo Bridge actually kick-started the full-scale invasion of the Japanese. It took them only 5 months to come to the capital of China back then. And then the Nanjing Massacre. What do you make of their intent of trying to capture the nation's capital and kill more than 300,000 people?
Well, Japan was and is a smaller country than China, but they invaded a huge country. They want to occupy and conquer the big country in a short time. And to the invaders, the shortcut is to threaten the people to stop fighting against the invasion. So when they caught the capital, they made a horrible atrocity. They want to, obviously, the authority of Japan want to intimidate Chinese people to stop fighting resistance against the aggressors. In fact, before Nanjing Massacre and after the massacres, they kept doing such to threaten, to intimidate the Chinese people. But to the opposite, the more killings, the stronger resistances that lead to their final failure in China.
Because it will deeply decrease the morale of the Chinese people against the Japanese by killing more than 300,000 people in its capital.
Yeah. So I think to Japan, but also to China, in a war, the capital means great, and their calculation was not only by capture the capital, but also by threatening the people. Then they can win both in the physical and the psychological. So such terrible criminal calculations drove the aggressors made very horrible crimes during their war.
And actually, that chapter of history was well documented, not only in Chinese document literatures, but by foreign journalists, and even by the Japanese military servicemen back then. But the problem is the Japanese government has been very unequivocal admitting to what happened in 1937. They say there are some killings, but it's normal when you invaded another country. What is the thinking behind the Japanese authorities by whitewashing the history?
Well, remember, you mentioned the journalists, but only a few journalists revealed the truth. Why was that? What was happened? Before they captured the capital, a lot of correspondents, including Japanese and correspondents from Western media. But when they captured the capital, they ordered ordered all the foreign correspondents left as soon as possible. But only a few, maybe 4 American correspondents, they were very brave. They decided not to leave, but stay to report the truth. Unfortunately, when the 4 correspondents recorded the truth, they were prohibited from reporting through their corresponding newspapers. In fact, all the stories, news stories, were reported when the 4 correspondents came out of Nanjing. For example, one of the American correspondents made the first report at American warships, not under the Japanese authorities. Even the Japanese correspondents were strictly prohibited from reporting the truth.
Strict control of information by the military of Japan.
So why the authorities at that time did that? That means even the authorities at that time of Japan, they recognized that was not good. That was a criminal activity. So they prohibited all the media to stop reporting, but they cannot stop. And for the current Japanese government, of course, everyone knows it's anti-human crimes. If they recognize the truth, then they need to rethink, reassess, revalue that part of Japan history. And unfortunately, now that part of history of Japan haven't been correctly reassessed.
But isn't it a clear understanding you will have a clear conscience only when you can face up to history and repent? Isn't that the logic in Japan now?
No. What Japan's logic was is like this: the historical activities at that time they did was not wrong. And at that time, Japan was a great country. Now they want to be great again. If you go to Japan, the current capital airport, I saw a slogan say, "Japan is re-rising." And I personally, I welcome Japan re-rising, but through what way, through what path? And the wrong recognition of the history of Japan indicated they were trying to re-rise in the wrong way based on the wrong historical assessment and recognition. So that's really worries for many Asian neighboring countries and the neighboring peoples, including me.
And that's why I think China established this National Memorial Day to remind its people of that dark chapter in history. But it was only established 4 years ago. What do you make of the timing of such a decision?
Well, Japan is rising. In the course of re-rising, now is a really critical historical point for every important nation here. And 4 years ago, we set up the legislation not only to educate the Chinese people to remember the history, but also want to remind for Japan to reassess the history. What we want is not to not to fan up the hatred, but want to make a common knowledge about the shared history. Actually, that history was shared by Chinese people, by Japanese people, by many Asian peoples. And we need a shared history recognition, and based on the shared concept of the history, then we can face the shared future. So I think under the current critical time, China's memorial movement or activities are really meaningful, not only meaningful for Chinese people, but also meaningful to Japan.
Yeah, it is meant for the Chinese audience and also for the international audience. Well, coming up next, we will have more coverage on the international recognition and response to the Memorial Day in China. Stay with us. So on this particular day, we not only honor the victims, but also show our respects to those who have devoted their time and even lives to exposing the truth. One of them is the late Iris Chang, the Chinese-American author of the book, The Rape of Nanking. Since 1994, she spent more than 3 years visiting many of the survivors of the massacre, referring to a large number of documents to recount the history to the world. And for more about the memorial activities about her, let's go to our reporter Tao Yuan, who is now standing by the Memorial Hall for Iris Chang. Good morning, Tao Yuan. What can you tell us about Iris and her work?
Good morning. Good morning, Zoe. Well, she's certainly best known for her best-selling book, The Rape of Nanking, in which she wrote in painstaking detail just exactly what happened in Nanjing in 1937, what caused it and what followed. A very bare-bone version of her life would be that she was born and raised in the U.S. Her parents emigrated to the U.S. Both are scientists, doctorate graduates from Harvard University. Iris Chang studied journalism and would go on to write 3 books in her short life. In 2004, very tragically, she committed suicide. She was researching for her 4th book at the time about American POWs, and she was definitely under a lot of stress and pressure from years of dealing with quite heavy subjects. And by that point, she had become severely depressed, and her family believes that she took her life under the hallucinatory effects of the antidepressants that she was taking. So, yeah.
And about her book, actually, she is an American, although she's ethnically Chinese, but she chose to write a book about the massacre in Nanjing, which grabbed the attention of the world. Why did she choose to write that topic?
Well, Zoe, that's actually a very good question, because unlike Hiroshima or the Jewish Holocaust, the mass torture, rape, and murder in Nanjing had largely been forgotten by people outside of Asia by the time Iris wrote her book. And she really single-handedly brought it back into the public consciousness. She called it the forgotten Holocaust of World War II, and she said she was afraid that if no one does anything about it, it's going to be reduced to a footnote of history. And her book was actually the first and full study in English of the Nanjing tragedy. And after the book was published, though, she received numerous threats from Japanese ultra-nationalists. Her friend said she became very concerned for her safety. She believed that her phone was tapped. She described finding threatening notes in her car, and she said she was confronted by a man who just barely said, "You will not continue writing this anymore."
And I know you are at the Memorial Hall for Iris, which is Huai'an in Jiangsu province. Why Huai'an, and what are the people there saying about Iris and her book?
Well, Huai'an is just about 200 kilometers north of Nanjing City. This is the hometown of Iris's parents, and although Iris Chang grew up in the United States, people in this city really see her as a national hero. This hall opened to the public in April this year, so a short while ago, and Iris Chang's parents, Ying Ying and Xiao Jin Chang, actually donated dozens of pieces of her old belongings to the museum dedicated to her memory. So we actually paid a visit inside to see what it looks like inside the museum.
There were stories of women who were nailed to walls and impaled after being raped, or nailed to boards and run over by army tanks. There were stories of people being hanged by their tongues on iron hooks, or buried waist down in the soil so they could be ripped apart by German shepherds.
History once forgotten. But young journalist Iris Chang stubbornly refused to let go, and she wanted the world to remember. Now she's remembered in this museum in her parents' hometown in eastern China's Huai'an city.
She was so young, she took on what shouldn't have been her responsibility and endured what shouldn't have been her pain.
6 halls dedicated to her memory, right in the center of the museum where it all started.
The visual shock of these photos prompted Iris Chang's quest for the truth. In her book, she wrote, "I was suddenly in a panic that this terrifying disrespect for death and dying would be reduced to a footnote of history."
It did not, thanks to her effort. 13 years after death, Her fight for truth continues to inspire younger generations.
She put a lot of effort into writing this. It's a really hard time for her.
She was a very brave human, and she never gave up in her quest for the truth and the pursuit of social justice.
Her old belongings shedding light on her life and work.
他们提供给我们女儿的性爱之物。
Her parents donated these to the museum. It was difficult for them since these are the memories of their daughter, but they also want to see her inspire more people.
精神的产品。
Words are the best form of life after death, she once wrote. Her legacy certainly lives on.
And the late American writer Iris Chang wrote the book, The Rape of Nanjing, a bestseller that threw light on that dark period of Chinese history. And our correspondent Mark New caught up with Chang's parents to talk about her legacy.
Visiting the gravesite of a beloved child is a cruel task for a parent. But each time Yingying and Xiaojing Tang come, they do find some comfort in seeing flowers already there. Strangers bring them all the time to pay tribute to Iris and all she stood for.
Iris has a very close relationship with me and with her mother. She always liked to ask questions with us. From time to time, she'll think about her. Yes, I feel the pain.
Earlier this year, the Changs were happy to witness what they see as a continuation of Iris's work, the unveiling of the first Comfort Women Memorial in a major U.S. city, San Francisco. But the Changs were disturbed by the reaction of the Japanese government.
Japanese government still continue protesting. They launched a campaign for a lot of people in Japan to write the protesting letter. They are forced, against their will, kidnapped those young girls and women to go into the military brothel. How could they deny this part of history?
The honors for Iris continue as this piece of land, just a few minutes' walk from her parents' home, will eventually become this, Iris Chang Park. But Microsoft's desire to build a well on this land for cooling their data center has caused an indefinite delay. When this area does finally become a park, it will feature a famous quote by Iris about the power of one. One person or one idea can start or end a war or subvert an entire power structure. It's that message that also inspires her parents in their own time of need.
We always continue her work, keep this part of history alive. That's
Mark New, CGTN, San Jose, California.
Let's come back to our studio's discussion about the Nanjing Massacre. Thanks to Iris and reporters, journalists, and historians like her, we know better about the Second World War, the Asian theater.
Yeah.
But the problem is, it seems the information about the China theater, the exposure of what happened is less pronounced than in the European theater.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, basically two fundamental reasons. One is the macro reason, that is the micro reason. The so-called macro reason is not only in the history of the Second World War, but also in the whole history. If you were a student, you will look, you will find the textbook of history always focus on the western part rather than the eastern part. That's the background. So when the World War came, and the historians in the habits focus on western part rather than eastern part. So not only the Nanjing Massacre, but also in the whole picture of the World War II, the gravity of the picture turned to the western and rather than eastern. And the macro reason is, as I mentioned earlier, the information, the truth leaked after the massacre in Nanjing were very little. And Iris made a lot of efforts to investigate, to find out, to research the truth. So before her systematic work, there's a very few informations and to reflect the truth. So that is the concrete reasons why such a darkest page of the history were forgotten by the world That's, I think, the big reason.
It may be forgotten by the world temporarily, but the truth will remain there. And today is a reminder of that truth 80 years ago. A memorial service will be held for the people who died in Nanjing Massacre, which were believed to be in 300,000. This is the scene at the Nanjing Memorial Hall for the massacre victims. Chinese President Xi Jinping, as well as other party and state leaders, will show up for the service. And we understand that Chinese authorities have been paying attention to memories of history, especially the dark history of Chinese being occupied and inflicted so much atrocities on. But do you think this kind of a memory can help our people regain confidence, not only to be not forgetful, but also looking forward?
Of course, actually, the real purpose for Chinese government's decision to establishment the law, the legislation, and the memorial activities because of the purpose of peace. All the atrocities happened in the war, and to avoid such a repeat.
Now we have the state leaders headed by President Xi Jinping, and also Yu Zhensheng, chairman of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, and other state leaders showing up at the memorial service in Nanjing. Yu Zhensheng, the chairman of the CPPCC, is believed to be able to deliver a keynote speech at the 80th anniversary of the Nanjing Massacre. Thousands of people were attending this year's memorial service in Nanjing, including servicemen, young students, relatives and families of the survivors, and friends and representatives from the international community. They will sing national anthem while observing a minute of silence to pay the tribute to the victims who perished in the winter of 1937. And also a declaration of peace will be read out. The bell of peace will be rung in memory of those who died in the massacre. It's a cold morning, as it was 80 years ago in Nanjing. This is National Memorial Service for the victims of the Nanjing Massacre. President Xi Jinping walked on the petals in front of the Memorial Hall in Nanjing. He will be observing, as everybody else at the site, a minute of silence to pay tributes to who died in that atrocity 8 decades ago. Well, China set December the 13th as a National Memorial Day for the victims of the Nanjing Massacre back in 2014. And back then, Chinese President Xi attended the first memorial activities of the Nanjing Massacre in 2014. Well, during that ceremony, he said the Chinese people will remember history while cherishing peace and creating a better future for all human beings. Well, this year marks the 80th anniversary of that massacre. And that's why he chose to come again, to join others, to remember those who were killed. The guards of honor in front of the Memorial Hall.
The National Memorial Service for Nanjing Massacre Victim begins now. Please rise to the national anthem of the People's Republic of China. Now let's pay a minute of silence to the victims. The end of moment. To the massacre victims, let's present the flowers. Now, let's welcome the representatives of the middle school students in Nanjing to chant the Peace Manifesto. The Yangtze River runs through the city of Nanjing. The flowers of Zhongshan Mountain are forever blossoming. In 1937, the tragedy befalls. On December the 13th, the city had been invaded. The Japanese invaders commit unspeakable crimes. Bodies covered the fields, and blood stained the Yangtze River. 300,000 lives were lost. In 6 weeks of purgatory and devastation, the world had been shocked and the whole country in mourning. The cold winter is the witness to the calamity. It's an unprecedented event and a dark page in human civilization. It's tragical, yet alarming. Weakness and poverty leads to shame and humiliation. Invasion and separation plagued our motherland. But the people were awakened and strived for independence and liberation. Reform and rejuvenation has prospered the country. But we should never forget history as its lesson to the descendants. Pains and sufferings is what made us strong. 80 years of struggle has been engraved in history. We were never defeated, but grew stronger ever since. On the Memorial Day of 2017, we are once again convened on this solemn occasion, wearing white flowers in commemoration of the victims. We wrote this peace manifesto to demonstrate that righteousness and justice never die. Friendliness and harmony leads to prosperity. Peace and development are the theme of the times. National rejuvenation is the dreams for generations. The words of commemoration were imprinted on the tripod. The history shall be remembered and forever engraved. The history shall be remembered and forever engraved. The history shall be remembered and forever be engraved. Forever engraved. Now let's give the floor to Mr. Yu Zhengsheng, Chairman of the CPPCC. Compatriots, comrades, friends, this year marks the 18th anniversary for the Nanjing Massacre. 80 years ago, the Japanese invaders committed the crime of Nanjing Massacre. 300,000 people were slaughtered, and millions of women and children were trampled and raped. The city of Nanjing witnessed atrocity, and this inhumane deeds is against human nature and is a dark page in human civilization. Today, we gather here to hold the National Memorial Service for Nanjing Massacre victims in commemoration of the deceased in the massacre and all lives that were lost during the Japanese aggression, as well as all people who had given their lives for the victory of the Japanese, of the war of resistance, as well as in commemoration of all those people from home and abroad that have given their life to our fight to independence. It's a declaration that we will never forget the past and that we will cherish peace in the future. It's a solemn declaration that peaceful development is our wish and pledge. 80 years has passed. The dark history of the massacre has been recognized by UNESCO as the World Heritage of Memory and will be forever engraved in history. Faced with the atrocity of the Japanese invaders, our compatriots rise and fall together and fight together, and a lot of people offered help to protect the innocent civilians and keep records of the atrocity. Among them are John Rabbe from Germany, Sindberg from Denmark, John Mudge from the United States, for their humanitarian efforts. The Chinese people will never forget. At the critical moment of life and death, and faced with the atrocity of the Japanese invaders, the Chinese people stayed together, and patriotism has convened us all. The Communist Party of China has led this effort against Japanese invasion and has played the main part in the fight against Japanese invasions. The Chinese people paid great sacrifice to defend national sovereignty and independence, and life and blood were given in order to defeat the invaders, and has finally won the war of resistance, and has yet written a chapter of resistance. In 14 years of fighting against resistance, we have lost 35 million people in casualty, and China has become the main battlefield for anti-fascist war and has made great contribution to the winning of the World War II. Compatriots, comrades, dear friends, we should never forget history and be forever engraved. The Nanjing Massacre and Manila Massacre, or the death rail of Thailand and Myanmar. The Chinese people and the people all over the world will never forget. Only if we can remember history can we build a better future. In the future, we should also keep the past in mind. We should keep in memory the stories of our predecessors in order to avoid the repeating of tragedies, and also fight for the continued human prosperity and peace. War is like a mirror. It keeps reminding us the preciousness of peace. This war, led by the Japanese militarists, has caused great casualties and pains and sufferings to the Chinese people and to the Japanese people alike. The people of China and Japan should cherish this peace, and peace needs the safeguarding effort of the entire international community. We should face the past in a candid manner and gain strength from it. To safeguard peace, people all over the world should work together to honor the UN Charter and international orders and further promote peace and development of the entire human race. To safeguard peace, China will stay committed to peaceful development. Whenever development stage we are, we will never expand and will never enforce what we have suffered to other nations. China and Japan are neighbors, and we have a lot of civil communications, and we go way back. Therefore, we should be friendly neighbors and learn from each other and conduct friendly diplomatic relations. We should further deepen our cooperation and foreign relations with neighboring countries, including Japan. This year marks the 45th anniversary of the official establishment of foreign relations, and our two countries should base our foreign policies on the interests of the two people, and peace and development and friendliness should be the theme. And we should learn from history and face the future and continue the friendly relations and contribute to the peace and development of the human race. Comrades, compatriots, friends, since the 18th National Congress, the central leadership centered around President Xi Jinping has shouldered historical responsibilities and proposed a series of new concepts, new strategies, and new theories, and has stipulated major targets and principles and regulations and major costs, and has thus promoted the development of the party and the country as a whole. In this solemn occasion, we are here to commemorate the past, commemorate the victims, and the patriots. With our efforts, our national comprehensive strength has entered the top league of the world, and our national position has been raised, and the livelihood of the people and the nation has been entirely changed. The socialism with Chinese characteristics has entered a new phase. Our mission calls for responsibility, and the mission will lead us to the future. Today, the Chinese people are stronger than ever, and capable than ever to realize the national rejuvenation. In this new long march, the Chinese people will also stay true to the socialism with Chinese characteristics and its theories, and with the strong leadership of the Communist Party of China, we will further our efforts to strengthen the socialism with Chinese characteristics and create better lives for us all. The Chinese people is more than willing to work with people from all over the world to build a community of mutual destiny and be the contributor to world peace and contributor to world development and the protector of world orders. And together we will build a better future for the entire human race. Thank you. Now let's release the doll representing peace and also ring the bell of peace.
The
victims of Nanjing Massacre Memorial Service concludes now. Please visit the Memorial Hall for Nanjing Massacre victims.
Well, that's the memorial service attended by Chinese President Xi Jinping and other top leaders. It is a memorial service to the victims who died in the Nanjing Massacre 80 years ago. Yu Zhengsheng, the chairman of the CPPCC, made a keynote speech. He reminded the Chinese people of dark chapter of the Chinese modern history. But he said the reminder is not to incite hatred, but to remind people of the importance of peace. China is a different nation than 80 years ago. China has grown strong and more prosperous. But China will not inflict the pains like it has been inflicted upon 80 years ago. To talk about the messages delivered at the memorial service, let's turn to Yang Xiyu, Senior Fellow from the China Institute of International Studies. So, Mr. Yang, 80-year anniversary of Nanjing Massacre, attended by the state leaders, and a message from the top political advisor. What do you make of their messages about remembering and also looking to the future?
Well, I think the speech just now sent very important two messages. Number one, memory the history for the better future. And the history we shared, although part of the history are horrible, that is one of the darkest page in the human history. But in reality, China and Japan and other countries remain having to share the future. So the key question is, what kind of future we should share? And the better future should based what? I think the message is we need to have a shared recognition and knowledge about the dark history, so that we can build up the better future.
You kept saying about sharing, understanding about the history, but it seems there are a gap of understandings between Japanese and the Chinese. You said that you visited the Japanese airport. I actually visited a museum at the Yasukuni Shrine. When the Japanese people visited that museum, they look upon those Japanese soldiers and officers as their national heroes. They took it as pride rather than as a shame upon that chapter.
Well, that's different values based on the different education of the history.
So that's the gap of understanding exists.
Oh yeah, but that's not the more important thing. The more terrible thing is the different value will lead to different actions in future. There's a well-known saying is that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it.
Yes.
Well, if you don't draw lesson from history, I'm afraid they will do the same or similar again. If you recognize the war criminal, as you mentioned, hero, and how I can trust the people who believe the criminal as a hero. So that's the problem for now. That's not history. That's not the disputes about history. That's the different views and expectations about our shared future.
But do you think there is enough pressure exerted on Japan by the rest of the Asian community? As Yu Zhengsheng mentioned, the Nanjing Massacre probably carried the same weight as the Manila Massacre. But it seems not all the Asian nations paid the same amount of attention to that chapter of history.
Yeah, exactly. Not only Asian people, but also many Western soldiers and the peoples in Southeast Asia suffered similar war crimes. However, in terms of the degree, the scale, no any cases in Asia, in the Oriental battlefield, has such crimes. So that is, in other words, Chinese people suffered the most during that dark history. That is why there's a different sentiments and knowledge about that history.
And how visceral they feel about the atrocities and sufferings.
Yeah.
Now we have our reporter Su Yiting standing by at the Nanjing Memorial Hall. Let's cross over to her on the latest about the memorial service. Yiting, we just saw the whole ceremony attended by Chinese top leaders. You were there on the ground observing what they did and what they say. What impressed you? What are the things impressed you the most?
Yes, Zhou, you know that people are arriving here very early in the morning, around 6 a.m., and you know that this ceremony has just concluded, and everyone just braved the morning chill to attend this National Memorial Day ceremony. And you know that Yu Zhengsheng, chairman of the National Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, has just made a keynote speech. And I'm here just listening to the speech, and what impressed me most is that Yu Zhengsheng said, we should remember the history, we should remember what happened here in Nanjing, but we should not remember the history with hatred itself. So everyone is here for the Memorial Day ceremony, and you know that everyone should try their best to safeguard peace and security. And you know that this place is exactly the place where the countless bones of the people have been found, and that is referred to as the mass grave of 10,000 corpses. And you know that when I'm here at the Assembly Square at the Memorial Hall for the victims of the Nanjing Massacre by Japanese invaders, it just reminds me the history. And you know that previously I also to visit the exhibition hall at the Memorial Hall for the victims, and they said that it's very impressive to see the historic evidence. And you know that Yu Zhenshen also mentioned in the keynote speech that the Nanjing Massacre, these historical documents were also added into the UNESCO's memory of the World Register. So safeguarding peace is the dream for everyone. And you know that if everyone remember the history and not remember the hatred itself, there can be the hope for peace. Zhou Yue.
What about the people attending this morning's memorial? What are their sentiments? Is it frustration, hatred, anger, or hope?
Yes, Zhou Yue, you know that this morning nearly 10,000 people from all walks of life attend this ceremony, including the veterans, the survivors of the massacre, and also soldiers, school children, and even foreign friends who have risked their lives to record the atrocities committed by the Japanese soldiers and invaders. And we also talked to some of the descendants of the international friends during the Nanjing Massacre. So for more on their reactions towards the just concluded the National Memorial Day ceremony, we're very glad to invite two of the attendees. One is Tony Skipper. He's the Lord Mayor of Coventry City of the UK, and the other one is Liu Chen. He's the holder of the UNESCO's chair for the peace studies. So good to have you on CGT, and both of you. You have already attended this very significant National Day Memorial Day ceremony. So what impressed you most?
Well, I just say I'm Tony Skipper. I come from Coventry, and Coventry, like Nanjing, has had experiences of war in the past. So I've come from Coventry with a message of peace and reconciliation, and to remember the victims of your massacre 80 years ago. In 1940, Coventry was blitzed, heavily blitzed. So we experienced, similar to the people here, of the horrors of war.
Yeah, we know that in August 1937, the Japanese invaders just make a very severe air raid towards Nanjing, and that's the same thing happened in Coventry City, because Coventry is also one of the, deadly damaged cities during the World War II.
I think the key thing, the horrors that happened here 80 years ago really are horrendous. But I say, back in Coventry, we were bombed, we were blitzed, and people died. But we move on, and we move on in peace. That's the message that we bring today. But we always remember the people who died.
Yes, we will remember the people who died, and that's what we are now doing, to commemorate the victims, to remember the history, and cherish peace. Nowadays we have. Okay, thank you very much, Tony Skipper.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. And you, Liu Chen, you also attend this very significant Memorial Day ceremony. So could you please tell us what impressed you most?
Yeah, so you know, I'm a professor of history department. History is history. Every party, including injuring party and also injured party, must face the party. This is why important for National Memorial Days. So I think the history is very important. This is the background. We're learning something for the past. Then we can find some power to building our future for peace. So, you know, I also a professor of peace studies. So, not mayor from Coventry with Nanjing, also some professor from Coventry University. So with Nanjing, this is unknown. We will hold a workshop for share common experience. Also, we share different heritages to find some common things to how to build our peaceful world, a peaceful the society. Also, to contribute a lot to contribute to how to say in the shared future of the human beings.
Yes, Xi Jinping has already called everyone across the world to build a community with a shared future for mankind, and that's the dream for everyone. And you know that Yu Zhenshen, the top political advisor, has made it clear in his speech that this year marks the 45th anniversary of the formalization of the diplomatic ties between China and Japan. So indeed, the people-to-people exchanges between the two countries are quite good. So what's your expectation in the near future? How can our both countries to move forward in the near future to safeguard peace?
Yeah, Japan, China is a liberal. Yeah, we are very close. We must come together to learning something from the history, then find the common ground to together to build our future. A much more beautiful world, and then to promote our relationship between our two countries.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Liu Chen. Thank you very much for your time. Okay, Zhou Yue, you know that both attendees have already told me that they think it's very significant to hold such kind of a National Memorial Day ceremony. And you know that this place I'm standing is the place where the victims were buried alive. But you know that nowadays we can see this memorial hall for the victims was in the shape of a ship, and that's the ship for peace. So the Memorial Hall for the victims itself is the symbol to call for everyone here to safeguard peace and to remember the history and also to build a better future. Zhou Yue, back to you.
All right, thank you so much, Yu Ting, for your reporting from Nanjing Memorial Hall. Well, the history is not only remembered here in China. The Chinese community in Toronto, the capital of Canadian province of Ontario, has also held a memorial service on Saturday for the victims of the Nanjing Massacre in the Second World War. Dozens of politicians, including the leader of Canada's Conservative Party and Toronto Mayor, joined over 1,500 residents at that ceremony. At the end of October, the Ontario legislature unanimously passed a motion to recognize the 13th of December as Nanjing Massacre Commemorative Day in the state. And various activities, including memorial services, concerts, conferences, have been held in memory of those victims of the Nanjing Massacre. And today we are honored to have Ms. Sue Wong join us from Toronto. She is the person who's behind this initiative, who proposed to the Ontario legislature to recognize December the 13th as the Nanjing Massacre Commemorative Day in the province of Ontario. She has been working to let more people know about that dark chapter of history. Let's talk to Sue Wong, a member of the Ontario Provincial Parliament. So Sue Wong, why are you working so hard to let Canadians and basically the rest of the world know better about Nanjing Massacre 80 years ago?
Good morning. I'm very pleased to join you to talk about what happened here in Ontario, Canada. We have an inclusive society in the province of Ontario. What does that really mean? It means that we welcome thousands of new Canadians into our province, and that include learning their history, their stories, and sharing those histories within our school system. So as a provincial member, provincial parliament, we have responsibility for the curriculum of all our students. And as such, we need to make sure young people in our province learn about this dark chapter, Second World War in Asia. We already have curriculum right now talk about the Holocaust, the Armenian Genocide, Holodomor. We have these special days in Ontario already. So passing Motion 66 in October this year, we're now given an opportunity for all Ontarians to learn about the 80th anniversary of the Nanjing Massacre, but also what happened in Second World War in Asia.
I understand there was a large Chinese communities in Ontario, in Canada, but what do Canadians know about a Nanjing Massacre, and why the recognition of that history is so important for Canadians?
Well, it's a very important part of the history, not just here in Canada. We have a very large Asian population in the province of Ontario, and not just the Asians, but also a very diverse community from northern part of Ontario to the southern part, from Windsor to North Bay. And it's very, very important we learn from each other's history, learn about those stories, but most importantly, we need to not to forget, because some of the victims and survivors of the Second World War are actually our neighbors, our friends, and our colleagues. Also, at the end of the day, when we remember what happened Second World War in Europe, we got to remember what happened Second World War in Asia as well.
I presume not many Canadians are well informed about the history of the Second World War. So what difficulties did you run into pushing for this initiative?
I think there's a lot of challenges because, first of all, as you indicated in your introduction, this is a very unheard of or unspoken chapter of the Second World War. It's always assumed the Second World War only happened in Europe, when in fact there's a really large component of Second World War in Asia. Just last year, the province of Ontario had has a recognition of the Battle of Hong Kong. So, which was part of the war, right? So the other piece here is we need to inform, we need to educate, and we need to make sure those stories, those atrocities cannot be forgotten, because at the end of the day, those voices and those faces of the suffering, like I said earlier, some of the victims and survivors are neighbors right now living in Ontario, and the atrocity dealing with the brutality against young women and girls, previously known as comfort women. We have just passed law in Ontario making sure that domestic violence, violence against women is no longer accepted in Ontario. So it is very, very important we protect and ensure this part of the chapter history, dark chapter of the history, not be forgotten.
And what do you think needs to happen to let the world better appreciate the efforts made by Asians in the Second World War and a better understanding of the atrocities by the Japanese aggressors?
Well, I think the really important piece is through education, through awareness, we're going to move the chapter dealing with reconciliation. Our goal always, in my work here in Ontario, is towards peace. Peace is the ultimate goal. But you can never deny this particular history didn't happen, because this is what the deniers want us to do, to forget that history, to silence that part of the history, making sure that chapter of the history is not taught in our school. That's not how we deal with facts. The fact of the matter here, this chapter of history did occur. Okay, and we know there are deniers out there. And for me, as Ontarians, as a parliamentarian in the province of Ontario, we need to make sure this part of the history needs to be taught. I know I'm very proud of young people in my province. They're learning about social justice or social injustice around the world, and they're learning. And I know some of my students in Scarborough Agincourt will be coming to Queen's Park tomorrow to share that learning and making sure that they are spreading this learning. I was just recently at University of Toronto Mississauga campus. They had 3 days commemoration of the Nanjing Massacre. These are university students. And this is a very busy time for university students. They're getting ready for exam. But they took time out to make sure that chapter was not forgotten.
But Sue Wong, do you think the Japanese government's ambiguity and evocations on that part of history is in the way of reconciliation?
Well, I can't speak for the Japanese government. I can only speak for my role as a member of provincial parliament in the province of Ontario. The key purpose of my motion, Motion 66, is to raise awareness, to make sure the information, the facts of that history, Nanjing Massacre and Second World War in Asia, not be forgotten. And through that remembrance, through that reflection, through that recognition, we need to make sure the faces, the voices of those victims, the survivors, and the families, because those families are living in Ontario. Like I said earlier, They are our neighbors, they are our friends, they are our colleagues, and you know, we welcome everybody in Ontario. We are a very diverse province, and one of the largest, my constituents in the province are Asians, and they need their story to be heard, no different than we'd heard about the Holocaust and Second World War. That's been taught in our classroom, and very shortly there is a component dealing with the Nanjing Massacre. We also need to make sure, through the learning of the history, we cannot allow that chapter of history be forgotten and not be taught in our classroom, because that's not what we want to do. We want global citizens in our classroom right now to be good citizens and be appreciative and strive for peace. And through peace, we're going to have a better world, hopefully.
Sure. Thank you, Su Wang, for bringing the memory of those to the front. And thank you for getting to agree to our interview. Well, memorial activities have been held today at the mass graves, also of massacre victims in Nanjing, several places. Let's go back to our reporters who are now standing by to bring us more reports on the memorial activities there. Zheng Yibing at the Zhongshan Dock Mass Grave and Yang Chunxi at the Qingdao Mountain Mass Grave. So let's go to Yibing first. Yibing, tell us what activities were held and what are people doing to remember those victims?
Well, yes, so actually a memorial service has finished a half an hour in this place. Even there, we can still see some people still laying flowers in front of the monument for the victims who perished during the Nanjing Massacre 80 years ago. This morning, hundreds of people participating into this kind of activity. And these people include government officials, local residents, and primary and middle school students, as well as soldiers and veterans from the National Defense University, who is based here. And during the memorial service back to half an hour ago, these people bowed and laid flowers in front of the monuments. And one of the representatives from the local primary school students, and she delivered a speech, and she said, "This is a very important day for all of us. We want to remember the history and do not let it happen again." And as well, this place is only one of the memorial service held site. And take a look at this map released by the Jiangsu Provincial Mapping and Surveying and Geo Information. Well, all the red labels showing the graveyards, mass graveyards across the whole city of Nanjing. This Zhongshan Dock is located at north end part of of Nanjing, the capital city of the Jiangsu province. Back to 80 years ago, over 10,000 Chinese were slaughtered by the Japanese aggressors into this transportation hub of the Nanjing. Back then, it was the capital of China. And actually, this morning, we know that at least 22 the mass graveyards across the city holding the similar ceremonies for those victims. Take a look at this white flower in front of my chest. Well, this white flower is a tribute to those victims, but please take a look at the core of this flower. This is a peace dough. Just like the representative from the local student said, all the efforts today is to remember the history and do not let the massacre or the tragedy happen again in the future. Back to you, Soviet.
All right, thank you, Yibin, for your reporting. Now let's turn to another reporter of ours, Yang Chunxi, at another memorial site, that is the Qingdao Mountain Mass Grave. Earlier, Chunxi, you said that there were some university students showing up. What are their memories of that history?
Hi, Zoya. A memorial event was held here by the teachers and students from Hohai University, as well as the citizens who live nearby the Qinglangshan Mountain Mass Grave. It started on 10 a.m. as the scheduled siren went off and was heard across the city, a reminder of the horror that was felt here 80 years ago and the struggle and resilience of the people in Nanjing. Students, faculty members, and citizens who live nearby have gathered. The national anthem was played, and people paid their silent tribute for 1 minute. After that, they put flower baskets around a memorial monument here in the campus. Now behind me is the 3 meters high monument that was built in 1985. We told you what's carved on the top, but on the body it has scriptures on it that written in Chinese, English, and Japanese documenting what happened here in 1937. Now for more, we talked to a student representative from Hohai University, Ye Tong. Thank you very much for joining our program. So how did you feel about today's memorial event?
I think it is very meaningful and thought-provoking. Peace and development is a common theme of mankind, and I think it is important for us to take history as a mirror, learn from it, and expect a bright future.
Now, you are a sophomore student in this university?
Yeah, I'm a senior.
You're a senior student. So as a university student, what do you think that this part of history means for today's younger generation in China?
Well, people in Nanjing have suffered a lot from the war, and we cherish peace and value life even more than before. And as a student, as a younger generation, I think it is important for us to remember the history, and so as to remind us to work harder and contribute to building our country as into a stronger and more powerful nation. And we are dedicating ourselves to the construction of a new Nanjing.
Thank you very much for sharing. Now, this afternoon I'm going to cover a ceremony ritual attended by Buddhist monks from China, Japan, and South Korea, as well as a candlelit visual event downtown in the Memorial Museum. Back to you, Zhou.
Yes, indeed, and keep us posted on that. Thank you very much, Chengxi. Well, the Nanjing Massacre is gaining more and more attention around the world as more evidence is uncovered. And CGTN reporters have talked to people from different countries about the history. And for our viewers, what do you know about the events in Nanjing in 1937?
Have you ever heard of the Nanjing Massacre?
No, what is this?
No, unfortunately not. I'm so sorry that I don't even know that I haven't heard of it.
Nanjing, yeah, sure. Well, that's tragedy. It must not happen again.
Have you heard of the Nanjing Massacre?
No.
No. Have you heard of Auschwitz?
Yes.
Yeah.
I know of Auschwitz around the same time, but because we studied it in school, but I haven't heard of the Nanjing Massacre. So it's quite a surprise to find out now that so many people were murdered.
You have heard of Auschwitz concentration camp, right?
Yes, definitely.
So in schools, it's a lot more taught, not so much about...
Well, not just in schools, but in the culture here, and on television and museums and things like that. So, yeah, what happened in China, in Manchuria, isn't very well publicized here.
But for those people in countries more close to China, awareness is different.
Have you heard of Nanjing Massacre?
Yes, I've heard of it, but I don't know a lot of the details about the story.
I've heard about Nanjing Massacre. Japanese killed a lot of people when Nanjing was the capital of China. They also raped a lot of women.
The Nanjing Massacre, it's like, I know. It's in China?
No, I've never heard.
You have heard about Auschwitz?
Of course. Yes, I'm a Jew. How can I not know about it?
I mean, if I'm not wrong, half the population was wiped out during that period of time.
Well, it was an appalling atrocity. Australia was involved because Robert Menzies was selling pig iron to the Japanese, and the unions boycotted a ship that was transporting pig iron to the Japanese in protest against those massacres.
I think it's not just about Nanjing Massacre. I think those countries that have experienced the things like this in their history, like massacres and atrocities, we need to find out the truth.
Well, people are forgetful. As Edmund Burke said, those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it. The more important question is whether you forget history or you choose to forget history. And before we go, let's have a review of today's memorial service and a look back at what happened 80 years ago.